Mrs. Johnston here. It is knowledge and social studies times. We are working in Unit 10 on colonial towns and townspeople, and we are on lesson 4 today called The Cloth Makers, Spinners, and Weavers. Before we begin, let's do a little discussion about what we remember from our previous read aloud. Remember, our last read aloud was about the miller and the baker. They were tradespeople who made and helped in the making of bread. Can you tell me what you remember about the miller and the baker? Did you remember that the miller is the person responsible for taking the wheat and corn and grinding it into flour? Then the baker takes the flour, mixes it with some water, yeast, and a little bit of salt, and bakes it into bread or other sweets like donuts or rolls. Today, we are going to learn about the cloth makers. Did you know that your clothing is made out of fabric or cloth? Today's read aloud will teach you about how cloth was made long ago in the colonial times. Most of the cloth used for our clothing today is made in factories with the help of big machines, but it hasn't always been that way. Throughout most of history, there were no factories and no complex machines. 300 years ago, in a colonial town, people made cloth by hand. I'm going to check to see if you understand what we've been talking about so far. I want you to give me a thumbs up if my answer is yes, and a thumbs down if my answer is no. Clothing is made out of cloth. Did you give me thumbs up? The answer to that question was yes. Most of our clothes are made by hand today. Did you give Mrs. Johnston a thumbs down? That answer was no. In colonial times, most clothes were made by hand. Did you give me a thumbs up? That answer is yes. There were lots of factories in the colonial times. Did you give me thumbs down? That answer was no. Today you will learn about two tradespeople, the spinner and the weaver, who helped with different steps in the process of making cloth. Listen carefully to find out how cloth was made in colonial times. Several hundred years ago, farmers made their own cloth from materials they gathered from their farms. Most farmers sheared wool from sheep they raised on their farms. On a few farms where cotton was grown, farmers picked cotton from cotton plants that grew in the fields. The farmers' wives cleaned, combed, dyed, and spun this cotton or wool into thread before weaving it into cloth. But this took a lot of time. So if they had several garments or pieces of clothing to make, they could give their cotton or wool to tradespeople who made the cloth for them. Today, we will learn about spinners and weavers, two types of tradespeople in town who had tools that helped them make more cloth at one time than a farmer and his family could make by themselves. Many farmers used the wool of sheep to make cloth. Once a sheep's coat was thick, farmers would shave or shear off the wool with a sharp blade. The wool grew back, and the sheep were ready to be sheared again the following spring. Let's take a close look at cotton, a plant grown on farms in the southern colonies along the coast. The cotton first had to be planted and then hand-picked from the plant. A cotton ball in the seed pod of a cotton plant. Farmers plucked the white string-like cotton fibers found inside the cotton ball. The stalk of another plant called flax could also be picked apart into fibers that could be made into a cloth called linen. Whether cotton or flax, farmers needed to clean the fibers to remove the seeds and dirt from these plant parts before using them to make cloth. The first step in making cloth is to make the cotton, flax, or wool into thread. In this picture are some tools the farmer had at home that would help him do this. After the cotton, flax, or wool was cleaned, it had to be combed with a tool called a cardder. As you can see from this picture, hand carders look similar to a cat or dog brushes. Women would use two carders at a time to brush the wool until all the fibers lined up in the same direction. Once the fiber was combed, the women might dye the cotton or wool different colors using the juice from different plants or berries. Dyes back then were homemade too. They dipped the cotton or wool in the dye, allowing it to soak up the colorful juices. Dyeing was hard work and took a long time, so farmers usually skipped this step if they were making cloth at home. That's one reason why the clothing sewn at home from cloth made on the farm in those days was so plain, usually just a whitish beige color. It was a rare treat to buy colorful cloth in town. Next, women making their own clothes at home used small wooden spindles like this one to twist the clean fibers into thread. Women turned the spindle by hand to make yarn that was much stronger than a single fiber of cotton, flax, or wool. If a farmer could afford it, he would buy a spinning wheel like this one for his wife. The spinning wheel like this one for his wife. The spinning wheel allowed a woman to turn cotton, flax, or wool fibers into yarn or thread by twisting them together very tightly. A spinning wheel could spin wool into thread much more quickly than a hand spindle. In rare cases, when a farmer was very wealthy or lived near a large town, he would buy thread from a spinner, a tradesperson who turned cotton, flax, or wool into thread using a spinning wheel. The spinning wheel not only had a spindle attached to it, but it also has a big wheel and a foot pedal called a treadle. The spinner would step on the treadle to make the big wheel spin. This was called treadling. See how the thread between the woman's left hand and the spindle has begun has been spun into thread and is ready to be collected on the spindle. A large spinning wheel turned the spindle around quickly, allowing the spinner to make a lot of thread or yarn in one day. One way that farmers and their families could save time was to buy yarn or thread from the spinner and then weave this thread into the cloth by hand at home. Or if they wanted to save even more time and effort, they could visit another tradesperson, the weaver, to make the cloth for them. After the spinner made the yarn or thread, the weaver took over. The weaver's job was to weave yarn or thread into cloth. If you look at the clothing you are wearing right now, you'll see that the cloth is actually made up of lots of little rows of thread, just like in this picture. Some of these rows go up and down, and others go across. To do this, the weaver used a tool called a loom. A typical loom had pedals that the weaver used to control the machine's parts. The weaver used a special piece called a shuttle to carry the strings back and forth from one side of the loom to the other. The newly made cloth was rolled up on the bolt underneath the loom. So after the flax, cotton, or wool is made into thread, what is the last step to make it into cloth? To weave it on the loom. Today, cloth is made in factories by machines, but these machines spin and weave just like the tradespeople did long ago. If you've ever been to a fabric store, you've seen many different types of fabric that have been made by machines. So now you know how the cotton, flax, and wool were woven into cloth by hand years ago, both at home and by the spinners and weavers in town. What is the main topic of today's read aloud? The main topic is how cloth was made in colonial times. What plants could be used to make cloth? Cotton and flax. What animal also provided material for cloth? Sheep. What is the tool that looks like a cat or dog brush that the farmers use to comb the cotton, flax, or wool into straight fibers? It was called a carder. Did farmers' wives often make colorful cloth at home? No. Why not? It took too long to make dyes from plants and berries and then dye the cotton or wool. We learned about two tools that could be used to speed up the process of making thread by spinning. Which tool was good for small jobs? A hand spindle was good for small jobs. Which tool was good for large jobs? A spinning wheel was good for large jobs. What could you buy from a tradesperson who was a spinner? You could buy yarn or thread. Could you buy cloth from a spinner? No. Why not? Spinners made yarn or thread only. What did a weaver do? The weaver wove thread or yarn into cloth. What machine did a weaver use to make large pieces of cloth? The weaver used a loom. Mrs. Johnston hopes you enjoyed our story today and learning more about the cloth makers, spinners, and weavers.